Henry Tudor was not born to be king. He did not grow up surrounded by certainty, power, or admiration. Instead, his early life was defined by loss, danger, and exile. Yet this unlikely figure would go on to found one of the most famous dynasties in English history and quietly reshape the English monarchy forever. When Henry VII took the throne in 1485, England was exhausted by decades of civil war. When he died in 1509, it was richer, more stable, and ruled by a crown stronger than it had been for generations. His reign lacked the drama of his son Henry VIII, but without Henry VII, the Tudor age would never have existed. Henry was born on January 28, 1457, at Pembroke Castle in Wales. His birth was shadowed by tragedy from the very beginning. His father, Edmund Tudor, had died 3 months earlier, leaving Henry a posthumous child. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was only 13 years old at the time of his birth. Margaret was intensely pious, intelligent, and fiercely devoted to her son, and she would become one of the most influential women of the age. Henry's bloodline gave him a tenuous claim to the English throne through the Beaufort family, descendants of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. But this claim was weak, contested, and originally barred from succession. In a world of powerful rivals, Henry was never supposed to win. England during Henry's childhood was consumed by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. Henry belonged loosely to the Lancastrian cause, and as the Yorkists gained the upper hand, his life became increasingly precarious. At the age of 14, Henry was sent into exile in Brittany, where he would remain for nearly 14 years. During this long exile, he lived under constant threat of capture or assassination. Used as a bargaining chip by European rulers and trained himself in patience, observation, and political caution. These years shaped Henry profoundly. He learned to survive by being careful, secretive, and calculating, traits that would later define his reign. By the early 1480s, England was ruled by Richard III, whose seizure of the throne in 1483 created deep unrest. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower and Richard's increasingly unpopular rule opened the door for rebellion. Henry Tudor emerged as the last viable Lancastrian claimant, supported by disaffected nobles and foreign backers. In August 1485, Henry landed in Wales with a relatively small force and marched toward confrontation. On August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry faced Richard III. Against the odds, Richard was killed in battle, the last English king to die on the battlefield, and Henry was proclaimed king. Henry VII's victory marked the end of the Wars of the Roses, but securing the throne proved far more difficult than winning it. His claim was weak, and many still saw him as an upstart. Henry moved quickly and decisively. He dated his reign to the day before Bosworth, allowing him to label Richard's supporters as traitors. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses symbolically and politically. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York were combined into the Tudor Rose, a powerful image of reconciliation and unity. Once crowned, Henry focused relentlessly on stability. He ruled not as a warrior king, but as a cautious administrator. Rebellions did occur, most notably those involving pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, but Henry crushed them through a mixture of military force, diplomacy, and calculated mercy. He often spared defeated enemies, binding them with financial penalties instead of executions. This approach discouraged rebellion while strengthening royal authority. One of Henry VII's greatest achievements was the transformation of royal finances. When he came to power, the English crown was nearly bankrupt. By the end of his reign, it was solvent and increasingly wealthy. Henry enforced financial discipline with an iron hand. He revived feudal dues, imposed bonds and recognizances on the nobility, and ensured that taxes were collected efficiently.
These methods made him deeply unpopular among the aristocracy, who saw him as greedy and oppressive. Yet they also broke the power of overmighty nobles and ensured that the crown, not the nobility, dominated England. Henry's rule marked a turning point in the nature of kingship. He relied less on feudal loyalty and more on bureaucracy, law, and centralized control. Institutions like the Court of Star Chamber were used to enforce order and curb noble excess. His council was staffed increasingly by trained administrators rather than hereditary magnates. This shift laid the foundations of the modern English state. In foreign policy, Henry was cautious but effective. He avoided costly wars and instead used diplomacy, trade, and marriage alliances to strengthen England's position. He negotiated favorable trade agreements, including the Intercursus Magnus with Burgundy, which boosted English commerce. Through strategic marriages, he linked England to major European powers. His eldest son, Arthur, married Catherine of Aragon, forging an alliance with Spain. His daughter, Margaret, married James IV of Scotland, a union that would eventually lead to the unification of the English and Scottish crowns under the Stuarts. Henry personally was reserved, suspicious, and deeply private. He was not charismatic and rarely sought public affection. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent, cold, and intensely focused on control. He trusted few people and kept tight reins on his court. His later years were marked by growing paranoia, especially after the deaths of his wife Elizabeth and his son Arthur. These losses deeply affected him, leaving him emotionally withdrawn and increasingly harsh in his policies. Yet Henry was also a patron of learning and architecture. He supported the early English Renaissance and commissioned the magnificent Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, where he would later be buried. His reign bridged the medieval and early modern worlds, closing one era while quietly opening another. Henry VII died after a reign of nearly 24 years. He was succeeded by his second son, Henry VIII, who would rule very differently and far more famously. History often overlooks Henry VII, viewing him as cautious, miserly, and dull compared to his dramatic son. But this judgment misses the point. Henry VII did not seek glory, he sought survival, stability, and permanence. He left behind a secure throne, a strengthened monarchy, and a peaceful kingdom. After decades of chaos, England finally had a ruler who understood that lasting power was not built on spectacle, but on control. In the end, Henry VII's greatest achievement was not conquest or charisma, but continuity. He turned a fragile claim into an unshakable dynasty and ensured that the Tudor name would dominate English history for generations. Without Henry VII's careful, methodical rule, there would be no Golden Age, no Reformation monarchy, and no Henry VIII as we know him. He was the king England needed, even if it never quite loved him for it.